Okay, now I've been ranting a little bit because of the floods about flood resilient. Now I've got with me one of our crew, Corey, who has a long history of working in the conservation game. He's got 10 times the qualifications that I will ever have in conservation. He's worked for English Heritage, so this guy knows his stuff. Now, I've seen recently that somebody goes around waving the flag and saying, I've got an OBE in flood resistance or something. I don't quite get it, but anyway, this was something that was tweeted recently, and it's like a little magazine on the internet, and it's all about flood resilience, which is a fantastic idea, and I'm right behind people like the Environment Agency and NFU Mutual working with homeowners to make sure that their houses can resist floods. But the interesting thing is, once you start diving into it, this is a compilation of old buildings, and here this one, Claire in Todmorden, so she's obviously been flooded, in a beautiful old solid walled stone built house, and what they've said here is, this is what we've done, this is how we have made this house resilient to flooding. It's probably one of the worst examples I've ever seen of the abuse of an old building, and a guarantee that this building is going to be wet forever, and it will probably damage the building structure very significantly. So what it says here, the rebuild involved excavating and tanking the whole of the ground floor of the cottage. The original stone flags were removed and sold to a builder's merchant. A combination of layers of hardcore, a waterproof plastic membrane which continued up the walls to 1 metre high, and insulating foam was topped with 4 inches of concrete. It was sealed to give a gloss finish. The walls were then rendered on top of the membrane using coloured renders which were polished. I don't know, this is ridiculous. So what we've done is we've taken out the original breathable floor, which allowed moisture from underneath the building to evaporate through the floor, to dissipate, and didn't force water into the walls of the building and push water under the floor because it couldn't be trapped. Now we've completely tanked the building, and there is absolutely no way on earth that water now can get out of this. The building will also be suffering from condensation within the structure, and of course putting all this rubbish on the walls has now trapped condensation from living in the building during the year. I don't know if Corey's got any ideas about this, but
it's, yet again, we see this time and time again, surveys going out there looking at it. It's the same repetitive pattern of abuse with traditional structures that you see. It's this modern intervention, this removing the vapour permeable material and replacing it with the vapour restrictive modern materials, cementitious based mortars, concrete, gypsum plasters, etc. Now, to do it in this environment where it's obviously, we don't know what the flood history is of the building for a start, but if it has flooded, we'd probably be looking at creating something more defensive in nature. So the external would be my advice, but leaving the original materials in place or replacing on a like for like basis. It might not be a listed building, but it should be treated as such, and those materials have worked.
For
hundreds of years. And the fact that, you know, they've made a point of saying that the flags, the historic material, has been taken up and sold to a builder's merchant is just comedic in the extreme. It almost sounds like they've essentially, what we say, career printed, they've used the same sort of driveway system that you find, you know, you use commercially in driveways and in printed forecourt, and they've applied to the inside. And as Pete said, all that's doing is any moisture that's gone in, I'd like to know what the drying out rates, you know, they've probably recommended, you know, dehumidifiers go in there, as we, you know, recently found, you know, dehumidifiers don't actually,
They don't work.
they don't work. It should be allowed to dry out naturally. Now, to that end, if I was looking at that building in that situation, I'd be looking at saying, right, well, we lift the flags, obviously, we see what the condition of the subfloor is. If that has to be removed, fine. But then we can look at replacing with a GSL blown glass and limecrete floor with the flags retained and put back down on top. Looks like it's a stone structure.
Yeah.
So it would make sense to actually take as an opportunity to strip any modern plasters that are on the walls back, expose the stonework, and look at repointing in lime and lime washing pigmented lime earthborne paints, something to allow the building to breathe. Electrics are another consideration. If this is the first time, I mean, what you can do is just move your electrics up.
So some of the stuff that's been done in this thing is, I'm not completely rubbishing. I mean, the whole idea about a publication like this, and don't get me wrong, the person that wrote this and supervised this has got the right thoughts, trying to make a building resilient. What I'm focusing on here is the stuff that they're doing to the actual structure of the building. As Corey said, a lot of what they're talking about here is very correct. They are moving the electrics up, they are doing all the right things, but they are not understanding the basics of the building structure. There's another one here, Todmorden, a stone-built house, and what does it say? What do we tell everybody to do? Get your house breathing. What does this do? Walls now have resilient plaster to the same height as a membrane. The finished floor level is 6 inches higher than previously, and the membrane continues for another 6 inches above this. The government's £5,000 grant was spent on treating the front walls of the stone building with a waterproofing solution. Now perhaps Corey can tell you what that's going to do to the building.
If I can use the analogy, if you were to take your washing out of the washing machine and place it in a bin bag and hand that bin bag on the line, would you expect your washing to dry? If the answer to that question is no, then that's exactly what's going to happen to that building. It's that simple. 80% of your evaporation in this wall is lost through the mortar joint. As soon as you start applying these weird and wonderful chemicals and quick fix plasters, it just kills that. What you are then going to see is a wall with a high moisture content. You're going to get localized stone delamination around the mortar joint. It's just going to create bedlam. So best not put the magic cream on the wall.
There's another one here, Wendy and Ben in Lancashire, another old detached cottage. Okay, they've done some interesting stuff that works, sockets have been moved up and so on, but again, waterproof cement render plaster. And what happens when we render the inside wall with a waterproof plaster? It traps moisture and it cannot get out. I've got another one here, Mark in Corbridge. A solid stone terraced house, filled in a suspended timber floor with concrete, at which point Corey starts to choke, and rendered the walls with waterproof cement.
It's just to repeat yet again, it's that just poor material selection. What can you say that hasn't already been said? It's yet again, it's that, doesn't matter whether it's an historic building. If it's a traditionally built structure, it should be treated exactly the same as any historic building, with sensitive material selection, allow it to breathe, allow it to naturally dry out.
And finally, I'm going to talk about this one, a cottage in Oxfordshire. This is an example that Corey and I are both familiar with because we are working with a similar example at the moment of a development where an old building has had a similar system fitted. After the poor occupant lived there for 2 years, the building is now being basically stripped, opened up to allow it to dry out. But here we've got a lovely old cottage in Oxford. It's had a cavity drainage membrane system, drainage channel, facade cream, I've not heard of that one before, water repellent facade, hydrophobic cream for cementitious based building materials has been applied. That's cool. I think Corey's, it's getting a bit boring, isn't it?
It's the same time and time again. I'm not knocking cavity membrane systems, you know, they have their place.
In car parks?
Yes, yeah. You know, in areas where, you know, people might have slightly different views on where they should be used, but in this situation where you've got a flooded building, does it say what the original construction material is? Is it stone built?
Stone built.
Stone built. It just seems that it's someone's come up with a quick fix plaster to try and get it through. Actually, all that needs is any modern interventions removed, repointed, as going back yet again, if it's one of those situations where it's regularly being flooded, it's taking those steps to lift the electrics, and in that situation, you know, if it is a repeat, if it is beautiful stone, expose the stone. Expose the stone, repoint, and accept the fact that every so often you are going to be flooded. It's yeah, unfortunately so, but this sort of membrane system is just not right for this application.
Totally inappropriate. What I will say is behind this membrane, the example that Corey and I were working on, behind this membrane, the wall will be soaking wet. And in the instance that they're talking about here, what they've done is the same thing as what we've just undone in another old house. Even the front of the membrane was wet. The membrane in this particular drawing, there's a photograph of how they finished it. It can't possibly work. The way that is constructed is completely wrong anyway. So basically all of these examples that we're showing you are sheer incompetence, lack of understanding of any of the basic tenets of working with old buildings. And as I say, I bow to Corey's knowledge. He has worked with English Heritage, he's worked on a lot of much bigger and better old buildings than I have, and we still have exactly the same approach to what we're doing. We might lock horns over the odd bit of tanking somewhere, but I think we'll put that in the car park where it belongs. So I don't know, have you got any overall, what would you say to somebody that's been flooded in an old house that needs breathing? Old house being a breathable structure, solid wall breathable.
The big thing, from what we're seeing at the moment, the comments that are coming back from people who have been flooded, unfortunately, is it's an emotional time. Your property has just been flooded, and you will go to your insurers and you will take advice from them, and they will take the lead and the pressure off you, as they should. However, the people that are being appointed by your insurers might not necessarily be, or might not necessarily have the skill set to appreciate how an older property works, a traditional built structure works. And it may be at that point worth just taking a step back and saying, right, hang on a moment, you know, we've seen Pete's videos, we've applied some common sense to what we know. Take a step back and just think, and if it does, just don't be afraid to ask questions of the advice you're being given. question, and if need be, I'm sure Pete will be willing to pick up the phone and speak to you should you require. But I think the big thing is just don't take it for granted that the advice you're given is necessarily the best advice.
There you go.